we've seen in the dry conditions, spring, summer and early autumn. So if we take what we've come to see as a sort of traditional ley in the last probably 35 years, roughly, something like that, generally based around ryegrasses, probably some white clover in there, maybe some timothy. And interestingly, we can see how sort of uniform the rooting of these species can be, especially the ryegrasses, which we know is productive in the right situations, definitely responds to fertility, whether it be artificial in a more conventional system or farm-up manure and that sort of thing. But we know it has weaknesses as well, and shallow rooting, burning up in the summer, is certainly one of these. However, happily, we have got other things in our toolbox that we could look to in terms of drought tolerance when we're thinking of different species. So here we've got some different species, and I'll go into them in more detail, but just roughly, we've got some herbs, so yarrow, for example, forage yarrow, some legumes like sainfoin, Ian's already mentioned, and some of the grasses like, already mentioned, and some of the grasses like tall fescue here, or timothy. So you can start to see already the difference in that rooting profile is quite stark. We can see we've got some very strong tap roots going right down into the ground, 2 or 3 feet at least, if not more. And we've also got more sort of fibrous roots on the cocksfoot, for example. Okay, so if we just focus on the grasses for a minute then, we've got a range of species that we might use in our sort of day-to-day more diverse mixes. So things like tall fescue is a nice example, the one on the end here. A deeper rooting grass, definitely, generally associated with lighter soils and therefore drought resistance or drought tolerance. Just worth bearing in mind at the moment, we are seeing more and more examples of crosses between fescues and ryegrasses coming into the market, which is very interesting, known as fesculoliums. So where we might look to harness the sort of stress or resilience or stress tolerance of some of these fescues like tall fescue or meadow fescue as examples, but also crossing that with the speed of establishment and the palatability of the ryegrasses, we've then got a separate species altogether. It's relatively early days. We've generally got shorter term fesculoliums which are based around crossing Italian ryegrass with these fescues, so 1 or 2 year persistence. However, I think more will come along. We've got maybe 1 or 2 varieties which are more like 3 or 4 years, so things are moving that way. I don't think it's a silver bullet in terms of drought or stress tolerance, but it's another interesting change, definitely. And then if we go on to a true drought-resistant grass there, cocksfoot, would probably divide the room in terms of your opinion, 50-50. Some people see it as a very useful green grass on dry land. Other people say it gets a little bit tussocky and a bit coarse. Again, there's breeding being done to increase the palatability and improve the overall growth habit of the grass, make it less tussocky. But certainly this year, and if we cast our minds back into sort of April and March time, it was still very wet and very cold, and cocksfoot was really the only thing I saw growing at that time of year, really, apart from maybe some of the really short-term ryegrasses. So I think it's really interesting, and this fibrous root mass here is really important for building organic matter in the soil as well, but it's a very drought-tolerant species, we know that. Meadow fescue, interestingly, on low fertility situations, we have seen that meadow fescue can be nearly as productive as a perennial ryegrass when it's not getting a lot of fertiliser. We know it generally suits the heavier, wetter soil, so it can be useful on that sort of stuff. Timothy's a really nice dual-purpose one. It actually grows pretty well on the wet, on dry land, although actually it's not as deep rooting as some of them. But also it can grow really nicely on heavier soils as well, so it's a really good dual-purpose one, often growing later in the season. So again, as Ian said, sort of expanding the shoulders of the season as much as possible in terms of grazing grass. And then smooth stalk meadowgrass, that's a little bit of an oddity in a way. Some of the older textbooks do talk about smooth stalk meadowgrass as a sweet grass, so it doesn't maybe be as high yielding as some of these ones, but it is there in the base of the sward, filling up the sward, carrying the livestock, and they do like it. And we know smooth stalk, as an example, does do particularly well on the thinner soils again, so in terms of drought tolerance it can be really useful as part of the sward maybe. So if we move on to the legumes, I'm sure you've all had experience with red clover. We know it's relatively low in persistence, 2 or 3 years maybe, but again this is improving. We're getting better persistent varieties coming through. But interestingly already, look at the difference in the rooting structure of the red clover, so a deep, strong taproot compared to white clover. That more stoloniferous, creeping growth above or just below the soil surface. So in terms of getting to moisture, breaking up layers of compaction, I think red clover can be really useful, on top of course, the high protein and all these sorts of things. Bird's-foot trefoil is actually becoming a favourite of mine. Seeing how it survived this year is quite incredible. Another coniferous plant, I think Ian again mentioned it. So if you are grazing swards with a lot of clover in, bird's-foot trefoil is useful because it will help to reduce bloat, especially in cattle. And again, a deep rooting legume. We saw it stay very green all the way through the summer this year. White clover, not as deep rooting interestingly, but with this creeping growth habit, it does seem to access moisture a little bit better, so it tends to deal with these drier temperatures better than the grasses do on their own. So again, in the middle of the summer, you often find a dominance of white clover in the swards as it deals with those lower moisture levels. Moving on to sweet clover, or yellow blossom as the Americans call it. Very deep rooting, very good on thin soils again in terms of staying green all the way through the summer, and also again with that massive root system adding to organic matter. And then the two pasture legumes that we do see in the UK relatively often, lucerne and sainfoin, similar species. They're both pretty upright, they both have that deep taproot, and they both suit thin soils. So again, if they're going to be on thin soils, they've got to be drought tolerant, and we generally see that, thin, high pH, stony, brashy soils. Generally cutting plants, but interestingly, if we start to break it down, you can actually get a little bit of difference between sainfoin and lucerne. So sainfoin, again, including tannins in the makeup, it's non-bloating in terms of livestock grazing it, and it is an anthelmintic as well, natural anthelmintic, so it's reducing the worm burden in certainly sheep, but also cattle as well. And then finally the forage herbs. So this is sort of a selection of 4 or 5 that we use fairly regularly on our more diverse mixes, and I think they all have their places. If you are sort of dipping a toe into the water of using these, there's some I might point you to which are slightly more reliable than others, or you can go in for the whole hog and have all of them, why not? But again, look at the rooting, very deep taproots here now. You will hopefully all notice a deliberate mistake. This should be sheep's parsley, not yarrow. Apologies, it's been a bit of a Monday morning, one of those I think. But interestingly, sheep's parsley, naturally high in iron, so if iron deficiencies are an issue, that can be one way of trying to bring those levels up. Plantain or ribgrass, a favourite of the Kiwis. They really like it, and they've done quite a lot of breeding on it as well, so we've got a few varieties available, which is great. Again, a deep taproot, strong taproot as well, breaking up layers of compaction, and I saw this stay pretty green all the way through the summer this year. The nice thing about plantain is it doesn't have this sort of bolting effect that the chicory has, so in terms of management, it is a bit easier. Yarrow, you'll see yarrow flowering at the moment, even on the verges. Again, deep rooted, generally suiting the lighter soils I think, and it stayed green all summer. Naturally high in manganese and copper, potentially if you've got issues with that. Chicory, you may have used this one before, it's probably the most obvious forage herb. Look at this deep taproot here, that can get down to some serious moisture at depth if it needs to. And again, we've seen it remain pretty green this time, and it's another natural anthelmintic. Interestingly, we find that with certainly ribgrass or plantain and the chicory, the levels of selenium in those two plants particularly can be twice as high as in ryegrass, perennial ryegrass for example. So again, if you have got issues with nutrient deficiencies, that could be one way of potentially trying to boost them. And then finally the burnet, forage burnet here, again a very deep rooting plant. Some of the older agricultural texts, so Eliot for example, talks about burnet quite regularly, how it stays green on his thin stony soils up in Kelso, in the borders. Okay, then just to finish off with really a few observations from this summer. Again, it's interesting that I think pretty much everyone in the UK has experienced these dry conditions, so you can all have an opinion on them, but I think this is really interesting here. We've got Bird's trefoil, again, as I said, fast becoming my favourite. This was taken in August, so we hadn't had any rain really on that dry farm at Honeydale since probably the third week in May, roughly. And it was green all the way through, and then it flowered quite happily, and it's still green now. I think it actually dealt with the drought really well. And yet the grasses, and this was only been down for about 4 years, so it's a relatively new lay of traditional grasses actually in here. They did burn off, they've come back now, but it's surprising how they didn't deal with the drought as well as the trefoil. And you can see a few sandpoints in here as well, which again stayed very nice and green all the way through. Just to highlight the point with the forage herbs, this was a photo taken on some riverland actually over in Wiltshire roughly, and it was very free draining gravel, so there was no moisture there at all. You walked through it in August again, mid-August, and you were kicking up dust. It was sown in May, end of May, it got one bit of rain. Now interestingly, if you can see here, this is one of the grasses that was sown in the mixture. So it's there, just about, but it really struggled. And then we've got a range here of lucerne, and so the root from the lucerne goes all the way down to here. Red clover, again the root starts about there to there. The sweet clover, as we've already talked about, a very aggressive taproot there. The burnet, again here, and then the root goes down to about there. And then the chicory, and again, so that is 3 months growth in terms of the rooting depth of these herbs in very dry time. So it's amazing how much resilience they can build in and survive, as Ian said, with one decent shower of rain just after sowing. And then just to finish off, so again this is Honeydale, so thin soils, it suits sandpoint and lucerne, and here we've got a field of predominantly actually sandpoint, about 10 acres. So if you just let me show you what we're looking at, so here, if you can forget that photo there for a second, up to here, that is a field of sandpoint, as is this, with a strip of lucerne up the middle here. It was cut in June for hay, the whole lot, and the regrowth on the lucerne was substantial after 6 weeks, much more, as you can see, than the sandpoint. So even within these deep-rooting, drought-resistant species, we've got varying degrees of regrowth at that dry time. And I mean, the sandpoint was sort of probably ankle high roughly, and the lucerne after 6 weeks after cutting was near back up to the top of your way again. It was really, really impressive. And yet you can see the sandpoint before it was cut was actually a bigger crop than the lucerne there. That's that same strip in the middle. So yeah, a really interesting take on two different drought resistant species and their regrowth. And then finally, you might have seen this photo at the beginning. So this was taken in the Isle of Wight, and interestingly you can see, again, sort of mid-August, end of August roughly, very dry, but we've got a nice green field here. And where's the green field come from? Well, interestingly, that is utilising a diverse mixture of all the species we've just been talking about, and that shows it quite starkly how much greener it was compared to the older permanent pastures and other lays in the area. I think these diverse species can be really useful in terms of drought tolerance, especially the deeper rooting stuff, when we're thinking of climate change. But interestingly, I think some of them, and you do need to match the species to the soil type, some of them can be really useful on heavier soils as well. So for example, improving infiltration, getting water off the surface, down through the soil profile, reducing leaching and runoff, these sorts of things. But be mindful that the dryland species might not like that sort of soil type. You've got to match the soil type to the plant species. So if you're looking at deep roots on wetter soils, it might be things like meadow fescues, chicories, ribgrasses, even boxwood to a degree. And then I think also with these deeper rooting species, you can see from that first slide of the sort of traditional lay, if you like, of perennial ryegrass and white clover, the lack of rooting compared to the diverse stuff. If we're creating those roots, they're breaking off, they're dying away, they're being recreated and growing again in the soil, I think we can really start to produce some better organic matter and therefore locking up carbon as well in terms of climate change mitigation. Thank you very much.